What if heterosexuality was not innate? What if sexual orientation was not immutable but could change? What if women could opt out of heterosexuality and choose to be lesbians? If any of this was possible, what would you choose? Hello, welcome to I Wish I Was a Lesbian. I am Angela Wild. This channel explores the idea behind the book I Wish I Was a Lesbian, Women's Lives Beyond Heterosexuality, published at Spinifex Press in May 26. Both the book and this channel comes from a simple realization. 45% of women will be childless and single by 2030. And one of the reasons I believe is the collective consciousness about the scope of male violence against us. Women are questioning the way relationships with men have been pushed as the default and seem to be looking for an alternative to what has now been called man-keeping. And they repeatedly say on social media they want to be lesbians. So this space was created to talk about that shift openly and honestly. On this channel, we will discuss the possibility of women not only opting out of heterosexuality, but embracing lesbianism as a positive personal and political change when this is what women want for their lives. We also challenged the myth that sexual orientation is innate and immutable, and we discuss as women who have made that leap the possibility of women choosing to be lesbians. This channel is hosted by myself, Tabata Spinster, and Michelle Kerwin, and in the next few episodes, I will be speaking to the contributors of the book I Wish I Was a Lesbian in upcoming interviews. You can find those interviews on YouTube, Spotify, and Substack. So if you ever thought, I wish I was a lesbian, but I can't, this space is for you. So today, I am very happy to welcome Sheila Jeffreys. Sheila is a feminist scholar and political author. She has written, I believe, 14 books, am I correct? Yes, mainly on sexual politics, feminist and lesbian history, and has many chapters as part of many collected work and anthology. I just want to show a few that are the most important, relevant, and I really particularly like. I will put all the links in the description so you can have your little dive or big dive in Sheila Jeffreys' work, which is so important. And welcome to the channel, Sheila.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Angela.
Well, so am I, and it's really come to my attention when I was building the book, of course, that a lot of women who were contributors, your work was so important to them. It's also very, very important to me in terms of work and in terms of meeting you, as I was lucky to hear you speak in 2012. And it's an anecdote that I recall in the introduction, because your intervention was crucial for me to be able to call myself a lesbian, so very important. And also because one of the things that I love about this project was that we are now in a position where many women of your generation of the second wave were not. We have access to the text you've written. We also are able to speak to you directly, which you couldn't do with the first wave of feminism, really. And so the reason why the book was so important to make the book intergenerational was this opportunity to benefit from women's perspective across the differences of age and experience. As we know, patriarchy evolves, adapts, changes, and hearing from women who have lived through different political moments help us understand those changes, but also because the work we do, especially as lesbian feminists, is systematically erased. So I'd love to ask you, your thoughts on that. One of the themes is political memory. You are a feminist historian. Why do you think preserving feminist history matters?
It's incredibly important, and I don't know whether it happens to other movements. I think it happened to post-war Communist Party of Great Britain, and there are other instances where political movements just disappeared, really, and the older members of those movements suffered a great grief because all that they had known had gone. I mean, the good thing, I guess, for us political lesbians from the 1970s onwards is some things remain. Our books remain to begin with, and to a certain extent, a lot of this is happening again. And it's happening again, partly because of your work, Angela, and this book. The ideas are developing again, not just in the UK, but also in Russia and China and Japan and Korea and so on. And indeed, some of the women, the exponents of those ideas now, the younger ones are in the book, which is terrific. But there's no question that over and over again, political movements do disappear. I think we're going to be slightly luckier with this one, so that's good.
I hope so. I hope so. And yes, and also thank you so much for your help in bringing these women together, because it's very much been a work of contacting women and snowballing and asking, who do you know would be interested. And it was very exciting to have younger women. I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm not yet 50, and I still consider myself as young. And then I was like, oh my God, there are some women here. Well,
You
women.
are.
So it's been a wonderful journey, and I agree, it fills me with optimism. And so, as we are, like, I want us to get maybe a bit deeper into the topic now. And the first question I like to ask is about compulsory heterosexuality and lesbianism, because there's a lot of confusion. Some viewers might be more or less familiar with the terms, but sometimes online, the way it's portrayed is actually going against its own definition. So I wanted to ask you, how do you define compulsory heterosexuality? What is it?
Yes, the term comes from a paper by Adrian Rich from 1980, but the concept was already very well developed in American lesbian feminism and in the UK as well. So the term means that heterosexuality is not some kind of inevitable biological situation where something like 98% of the population will be biologically heterosexual and 2% will be lesbian because of their genes. Something like that may have been believed back in the 1950s or 1940s, but who knows? But what we understand and what Adrian Rich understood by compulsory heterosexuality is that lesbianism is extremely well suppressed and repressed in male-dominated societies because it does not suit their interests. They need heterosexuality, and it needs to be compulsory to make sure that women will engage with men, because they need those women not only to have children, they need women, but they need women to look after them, do all of the housework, do all of the emotional looking after them, and they need women to be controlled, that is, individually in individual homes by individual men, so that all of these benefits, which are not just benefits for them, but this compulsory heterosexuality is necessary for all of the economies of the world. Women need to be doing this unpaid labor for individual men and for men generally in the way they relate to men in order to support the economies of countries all over the world and the international political economy. So it's got huge importance. And how is heterosexuality as a political institution for men and the world economics constructed? Well, it's been constructed by the suppression of knowledge of lesbianism. And this was absolutely crucial historically. Very few lesbians were known about historically or able to be found by anybody. There was no knowledge of it, although, of course, some women managed to find each other in the same bed in the quarters, servants' quarters at the top of the house, for instance. But there were places where women were able to find each other, but it was not in culture, it was not known, it was suppressed. And then, of course, it was suppressed by psychiatry, which made out lesbianism to be dangerous and extremely problematic and created a terrible stereotype of who lesbians were that nobody would have wished to be a part of. That was particularly happening in the 1920s when the lesbian novels were suppressed and these very harmful stereotypes were put out. So, and lesbianism was seen as biological. So it was seen by the sexologists, the scientists of sex, that you could not possibly become a lesbian. You were a lesbian at birth. There was a cartoon in the 1970s of a woman saying, "My mother made me a lesbian. Will she make me you one too," or something of that kind. But we understood in the 1970s that it was not biological in this way. What's amazing is that within second wave feminism, lesbians were able to come out and find each other en masse, right?
Mm.
Even though all knowledge had been suppressed from us. I mean, you didn't get taught in sex education at school that you could be a lesbian. Nobody said that you could be a lesbian. It was terribly important that nobody knew that. I mean, if you came out to your parents, they'd be absolutely horrified. Um, as my mother was absolutely horrified. Uh, so, so yes, compulsory heterosexuality was understood by us as a political institution about repressing lesbianism and forcing women's labour, their very existence, into the service of men under male domination.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful answer. There's so much in it. And when you were saying, oh, lesbianism wasn't taught at school, actually, there was Section 28 that makes sure it wasn't going to be, isn't it? And I'm wondering how much, in fact, Section 28 was directed more against lesbian than against the gay community as a whole, because we're a real threat, clearly. And also that really answers the first question where I ask about lesbian history or feminist history. All this is in it, the erasure of lesbians. Absolutely. So you are of the belief, I'm going to ask, obvious question, but you are of the belief that women can choose to be lesbians, right?
Yes, we did invent. I should have mentioned actually also the things like lobotomies and the terrible things that psychiatrists did to lesbians to prevent lesbianism.
Hmm.
Um, and I had a friend, Sandy Horn, who wrote Gayer's Guide, which was a guide to lesbian venues all over the world back in the 1970s and 80s. And
Hmm.
she was very badly treated by her parents, who sent her to psychiatrists in California before she got into all of that work. So, yes, it was very, very vicious compulsory heterosexuality.
So when you read the compulsory heterosexuality and the lesbian existence, that the list she makes of all the strategies, all the structures in place is so compelling. And when I hear women saying there is no evidence of it, read it. It's so clear. You cannot avoid.
Yes, yes,
And then
yes.
connect it to what's happened to your life or the life of the women around you, because it's impossible not to see once you read that text.
Yes, I mean, yes, I think we'll talk later on about what's happened now
Mhm.
to suppress all the lesbian feminist revolution that happened. I've done a book called Lesbian Revolution too in 2018, which talks about that whole movement. Um, can women choose to become lesbians? In the 1950s, sociologists in the Western world rejected the idea that human behavior was based upon biology. There are some who still believe it. Extremely right-wing
Mm.
sociologists may say that now. For instance, there are some in America who do research on how voting patterns are related to genes. You could be born voting for Trump, right? I don't think anybody sensible thinks this, but there were actual papers when I was in politics at the university. I came across these papers in which men actually said, yes, voting patterns biological, everything biological, basically, how you feel, how you think, etc. So in the 1950s, this was challenged. It was challenged around race, because there was this idea that black people would behave in certain ways, that they were inferior, that they had a low IQ, all of this horrendous stuff. And this was believed about women as well, that women were inevitably wanting to clean the toilet and wanting to be terribly nice to everybody and wanting to be subordinate and so on and so on. It was all seen to be genetic. But the sociologists of the 1950s attacked all of those ideas
Mm.
and started to it was a bit later. It was in the sort of 1960s, around 1970, that some sociologists started talking about sexuality in that way, including homosexuality. So, because up till that point, yes, sexuality had been seen as biological as well. I mean, it's a way of explaining the world as it cannot change.
Yeah.
This is God-given.
Mm.
This is the way that it is. It can never change. Don't even think about it. Well, the 1960s, 70s were extremely revolutionary, and a lot of people did think about it, and question all of those ideas. So, can women choose to become lesbians? Women may not see themselves as actively choosing, but women can certainly become lesbians with having had no knowledge of themselves as lesbians before, but they can become lesbians. And of course, those lesbians who say that you have to be born that way today say you can't become a lesbian. It's a kind of heresy and an insult to lesbians to say that you could become a lesbian. Actually, you can become a lesbian. You can become a socialist. You can become all kinds of things, actually. Uh,
Mm.
so can women choose? Of course they can apparently choose. They may not call it a choice. And women are becoming lesbians, became lesbians in the 70s and 80s. Some women were already lesbians, and they became political lesbians in the sense that they became feminists and started to call themselves political lesbians. But many, 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 so that you could be absolutely surrounded by these lesbians and never have to look outside for anything, whether it was fixing your toilet or, I mean, everything was being done by lesbians. And so, yes, lots and lots and lots of lesbians became lesbians. Feminists became lesbians because they were rejecting heterosexuality, and they considered that you couldn't really create a revolution if compulsory heterosexuality stayed in place. And of course, it was the case, as I explained in my book, Lesbian Revolution. It was lesbians and lesbian feminists who were in the absolute forefront of feminism. And we ran pretty much everything, the women's centres and the women's refuges and the women's bookstores and women's arts, women's bands, women's conferences. There were huge numbers of lesbian feminists, very prominent and at the forefront, the very forefront of the women's liberation movement. And I think that's one thing that I need to explain around choosing to be a lesbian, is that you were in such a vibrant, fierce, and huge lesbian community that once you left men, as so many not men, women were doing, and of course, as you say, they are doing now, but not in quite the same way. Once you left men, your whole life was with other women and women who were lesbians. You were dancing with them at the discos, you were fiercely discussing things, you were experiencing the total joy of lesbian community. And not surprisingly, when you had left men, even though some women, when they left men, thought, I don't think I can be a lesbian. Don't think I can be a lesbian. Of course, they did. Almost all of them become lesbians within 6 months or a year of leaving men
Mm.
because the women around them were so exciting. They were so wonderful, the lesbians, so attractive, with such extraordinary energy that it became also an erotic energy, and women became involved with the women around them. We're in a rather different position now, unfortunately, because though women are starting to develop these ideas, we don't have that community. We don't have loads of women's discos every week, some of which women danced bare-breasted. I never quite got around to that. But at which there was this extraordinary erotic energy that women could um, grow into and rise in love with other women. We don't have anything like that. And in fact, we have a legal system, which in Australia, for instance, makes it impossible for women to meet with other women without men in dresses, fetishists who like to pretend that they're lesbians for sexual excitement. So we've got a situation where instead of this extraordinary lesbian community, we have in some places, because of the rise of these fetishists, have have find that lesbianism is actually forbidden. We're not allowed to have that joy. Women are not allowed to get together in that way. So we are in a very difficult position, political position. The erotic energy that propels women into rising in love with other women is hard to create online, and nearly everything happens online.
Yes.
So that's quite a difficulty and quite a difficult situation.
I'm so enjoying listening to you. Like, this is why history is so important, and you're such a good historian, because you make it sound, you make it vivid. It's, you could almost touch it. And what is striking is when we talk about political lesbianism, very often women associated with an individual choice that has no other consequence than for the woman involved. What you're describing is an alternative, like clearly out of patriarchy, where you can find anything you want and need in a lesbian community. And you're right, it's not something we have. I have young women contacting me following the book saying, oh, I'm so desperate. I'm so desperate for any connection with women who think like me, who have these revolutionary feelings and thoughts, and who wants to create something else. And I mean, it's positive that this is happening. It is very hard to actually implement in real life if we don't have the spaces, and the fragmentation in our movement doesn't make it easier as well, obviously. So there's so much I want to say about what you've said, but we need to move on because I've got loads of questions. So I wanted to ask you your experience of becoming a lesbian. Of course, you've touched a little bit on it because you described what the movement was like. Um, but do you want to tell us a bit more about how it was for you?
I became a lesbian in 1978, I think it was. Um, the ideas of political lesbianism that lesbianism was associated with feminism and was actually the vanguard of feminism in its ideas, and that lesbianism was a form of resistance to male domination, and could be the core of a movement, a strong movement. They had come from America, where, of course, in the very early, just very late 1960s, early 1970s, huge numbers of women were becoming lesbian feminists. And political lesbians. And I think the word comes from there, the term comes from there, rather than from the UK. And
Mm.
that was happening in the early 70s in the UK too. There were huge numbers of women becoming lesbian feminists, and they were everywhere. So I was very aware of that. And I was I was being told by some lesbians around me, well, you should just become a lesbian. And so of course I was thinking about it at that time. And in 1978, I asked the young man who was my boyfriend and a lodger in my flat in Putney in London to move out. And they went and rented a flat on their own. So I think they were perfectly happy. Um, I worried about it a bit. I can remember worrying on the underground, what will Dave do? David Lowe was his name, the boyfriend. I got quite worried about it. Anyway, I went ahead and stopped myself from thinking about being kind and so on and asked them to move out. And within a few months, I started engaging in um, romantic adventures with women and finding out what it was to be a lesbian. But I think what I should also say here, because this doesn't get much talked about either, is that I had absolutely no idea what to do. Right? There were no there was no lesbian pornography. The horror of lesbian pornography did not exist. Women didn't talk about what lesbians did. There wasn't lesbian sex described in novels and so on. So in the first, couple of years or year or so of my going to bed with women, I had no idea. I mean, I was absolutely delighted, of course. And when I first rose in love with a woman, the thing that delighted me most was that just running my hand over her skin, the electricity between my hand and her skin was just extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like that before. So fortunately for me, it was an extraordinary experience. But I started off with absolutely no idea, as I started heterosexuality with absolutely no idea.
Mm.
When I first became heterosexual, I was looking at a book called Sex Manners for Men with the boyfriend, and we were both trying to work out what to do. There wasn't a pornography industry. You had to work it out. So any women out there thinking, what do you do? It's possible to work that out, I have to say.
Yeah.
Um,
Go on.
yes. No, I think it's important because people, women don't talk about these things, you know. Back in 1982, 83, there was a conference in London on sexuality with lesbian and radical feminists and a huge number of different workshops about sexual fantasies, about the problem of sadomasochism, about racism in sexual relations and who you chose as partners, all kinds of things. There were huge numbers of workshops. There were about 40 different workshops at this conference, and of course, hundreds of women there. Can you imagine that now? No. There's no discussion of sexuality or any element of sexuality at all. All that we're supposed to need is pornography, and so that horrendous male vision is what teaches everybody what sex is. So unfortunately, I would like to get back to that, you know, and it wasn't online, and we were all in rooms together talking about sex. I mean, great. That's absolutely
And
fine. And we
I
did.
can see now why it was so important to do it. If the society was so repressed in so many levels that you couldn't talk about it at all. And I'm not saying here pornography, but that you arrived in adult life with no understanding of what you're supposed to do at all, then it's so I don't know, it adds a layer of why it was so important to talk about it. But I think it's even maybe more important to talk about it now because of the
It's so
script
much more important now.
that is
And it
involved.
isn't
Yeah.
just that, I mean, by the time most of us were at this conference, we did know what to do.
Yeah.
But when we had to talk about the politics of it, the
Mm,
butch and femme, the sadomasochism, the racism, disability politics, disability and sexuality, all of those things were being discussed. So it wasn't a what do we do by that point, but it was a recognition that there's a massive politics of sexuality that needs to be discussed. And none of that is discussed now either.
no,
That's all
not very much.
complete.
Well, I will try. And so, yes, the thing that came to my mind is how glorious to be able to experience a new way of relating to a woman without that script, without that, this is what sex is like for men, for women together, and so on. And it's it's just incredible because so many women now live heterosexuality with a certain amount of trauma, a certain amount of horror that's been done to them. And it's very difficult to decolonize that. It's very difficult to heal from it. It's very difficult to
Indeed.
imagine anything different.
And astonishingly, Angela, there's no discussion of the effect of pornography on lesbians. The fact that young lesbians will probably have seen lesbian pornography, how they will feel about that, how that affects their fantasies, their sexual lives, their feelings about other women, their feelings about themselves as a lesbian and woman. There's absolutely no discussion. We didn't have this problem back in the 1970s, but there's a huge problem now, and actually nobody's mentioning it. So are we kind of assuming that that problem doesn't exist? It does
Mm.
exist.
But even the anti-porn movement is focused on what does porn do to boys, and by extension, how does it affect girls, but never how it creates your, well, you can't even call it erotic life, how it creates your responses sexually. And you were the first one that I read in Anticlimax talking about this, which was incredible, really, to that it's not been researched more, because it's
What
so
did we talk about more? Because it's creating how young women think about other women.
important.
So we get much more sort of a promotion of femme and feminized and sexualized appearance in the lesbian community. Women are maybe able to be attracted to that. I never could have been attracted to that. But that has been absolutely promoted and is promoted through pornography and ways of just thinking about women and what you might do to or with women. All of that is being constructed, and we're not talking about it. You're absolutely right. The anti-porn movement is, even if it's run by lesbians, is basically heterosexualized in its emphasis and in what it thinks about.
Mm. So there's a lot to say, and I still want to move on, but like I think what I take from that section of the conversation is you can reinvent your sexual life. You can imagine how you want it to be. You can maybe be led by how you feel and what you want rather than what you've been taught or what's been imposed on you. And I'm saying this for the women who are listening who maybe are like, I've got no idea. And you know, it was good that you touched on that point. Oh, thank you so much for really these deep thoughts that really, I think, move the conversation deeper and probably will help women understand some stuff. It really does to me. And I want to focus on the next question on your chapter. Your chapter focuses on the pamphlet Love Your Enemy, the debate between heterosexual feminism and political lesbianism. It was written by the Leeds Revolutionary Feminist Group. You were a member of that group. And I wanted to ask you a really question about where and when did this paper first appear? Can you tell us about the pamphlet, its main arguments, for somebody who's never heard of it?
Yes, the paper first appeared at a conference in 1979 because in those days all of our ideas were created through writing conference papers, not usually as individuals, but in groups. There'd be all kinds of groups, there'd be the Wolverhampton lesbian group, and it would write a paper about something and so on. So we, as Leeds Revolutionary Feminists, wrote this paper for a conference. It later got published by Only Women Press with lots of responses to it for and against and so on. So when we originally wrote it, as we said in the paper, we wrote it because we were concealing our lesbianism in a way. We would be asked by journalists when we were doing our anti-pornography work, for instance, are you all lesbians? And we'd usually say, well, no, we're not all lesbians. Some of us are. Actually, we were all lesbians. And I think, of course, journalists asked us that on the grounds that they could discredit our opposition to pornography by saying we were all man-hating and so on and so on. So we thought, actually, we need to just say who we are and make it clear. And so we wrote the paper Love Your Enemy to explain why it was important to be lesbians, why we'd chosen to be lesbians, and why becoming lesbians was absolutely vital to the feminist struggle and vital to all of us who were involved in writing that paper, all of whom had been heterosexual at some time previously. So the argument of the paper really is that it makes no sense to be involved in serious feminist struggle if you're heterosexual because you'd go to the meeting where you were building the revolution in the evening, or you'd go out to be, holding your banner at some serious protest, and then you'd go home to go to bed with your boyfriend and sort of undo in the evening, as we put it, all of the things that you had been doing in the day. Also, it was very strange and peculiar because what were you going to talk to your boyfriend about? You'd been out having this incredible time with women, this wonderful energy, creating a revolution, and then going to have this strange little private relationship. And so we felt that it was extremely undermining, as men were undermining generally. I mean, in those days, I can remember in Leeds, we would have our revolutionary meetings in women's front rooms, some of whom were heterosexual women, or round their kitchen table, very often round the kitchen table. And at some point, the husband would come into the room, or they wanted a cup of tea or whatever. Everybody around the table would go immensely quiet and all look rather uncomfortable and just wait until he had left. So that was the situation for men in our movement. It interrupted our train of thought. It made it very difficult for a lot of women to think in a revolutionary way because they'd have to think, how will that affect Nigel? Will it upset Nigel? Will Nigel be at the barricades with me? We called anti-sexist men at that time, and there was an anti-sexist men's movement. There were anti-sexist men's groups in every town. They talked about things like the difficulty of being able to cry when you were a man. But we would actually talk about, will Nigel be at the barricades with me? Well, actually, we don't want him at the barricades with me, but where will Nigel be? So it was a very live discussion. And we wanted to make it clear that women could simply leave and have a wonderful time with women, really.
Mm. And how was that received? Would you say it was a controversial paper? What was the reaction from heterosexual women and lesbian at the time?
Um, As I've been saying, there were huge numbers of women becoming lesbians and totally enthusiastic about it. I mean, we were joyful. There's no question we were joyful. We'd discovered something so extraordinary. We were no longer separated from each other, each with our boyfriend dancing around our handbags or whatever. And it was a new world. And I think at that time we probably didn't have an enormous amount of social interaction with heterosexual women because they were mostly with their boyfriends.
Mm,
Heterosexual women tend to socialize with men, and the lesbians tend not to be there, or they didn't at that time. But I didn't feel that there was a great deal of opposition. Women were seriously thinking about it, as I had been.
mm,
Heterosexual women were giving it very serious consideration because it was a very serious issue. So there began to be, a couple of years later, some opposition. There was a piece in Spare Rib by a woman called Anne Pettit, which was really saying that lesbians were hateful. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. But generally, there was not opposition. There was very serious consideration. And the women who wrote, the heterosexual women who wrote in Love Your Enemy when it was published as a pamphlet, they were very serious about it. I mean, it was a serious political issue, so you discussed it seriously. There's no question of that now. Heterosexuality could never be discussed as a serious issue now. So basically, what happened was that the book it was published in Wires, the newsletter, and then began to be discussed in feminist groups, consciousness raising groups, little circles of women up and down the country, often a very serious discussion. They'd say on Tuesday, we're discussing this. And then they would come together and discuss Love Your Enemy as a serious issue. It
mm,
wasn't just insult and defensiveness and so on. And I didn't realize how much that was the case until I went back to my archive and I was looking through it to write my autobiography. And I went back and was looking at the minutes of a group that we set up in about 1981. And it was called the Hlog Group with a Welsh accent, lesbian offensive group. So London Lesbian Offensive Group, Hlog, right?
nice.
Yeah, I suggested the title because lesbians were in London were getting very concerned that there was an anti-lesbianism developing. They thought it was in response to the Love Your Enemy pamphlet, and so we formed a group and we're discussing, and it's all in the minutes, over a considerable number of months, all of the responses that women were having, what was happening to them, what the anti-lesbianism they were feeling. I can remember that back at that time, I was teaching in a college, and a nice woman who appeared to be a feminist, and I said I was a lesbian, and she jumped back in her chair and she said, "As long as you don't do anything like that around me." And I was completely astonished. I don't think that would have happened now, but we were trying to change a whole culture as
Mm,
well as create lesbian feminism at that time. So yes, I would say it was discussed very seriously as a political issue. Nobody, the important thing is, not a single soul
mm.
was saying it's biological.
That's
Isn't that incredible? It
yeah,
was never considered. It
yeah.
would have been seen as so old-fashioned, so 1950s, so right-wing to say that anything like that was biological.
Incredible, incredible. I want to say that there's some stuff that you said that I really relate to. I remember so when I first heard you, and you know that moment in the room where I thought you said something like we were becoming lesbians and so will you. And I took it very personally. I thought, will I? Well, can I? And I think sometimes, and I looked around and I was like, oh, it can't be just me, surely. And I know that a lot of women were touched by what she said. But before and after that conversation, there were women who challenged me, who were like, Angela, you're a feminist. Why the hell are you with men? And just, yeah, giving it serious thoughts was something that I really did. It made sense to me, very, very early. When I heard you, it made sense straight away. And I don't see that now. I see a very polite silence. in fact. I think
Yes.
maybe women are thinking about it, but they're not thinking about it out loud. And I would really like, and that was really the project of the book, that, you know, the way you describe how it was discussed in reading groups, in consciousness raising session, that's the aim of it. It should be discussed there. It shouldn't be discussed on Facebook or on Twitter, you know, in small format discussion that are so frustrating because nothing goes in depth and because you can't really share personal thoughts there. And I hope that this is what is happening. And but I can't help notice that this discussion, like, it's very difficult to find places to actually have these conversations, even in the feminist movement, because there's a real defensiveness, which I find very surprising and sad. Because if you're not going to discuss your private life, like, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we feminists? If it's just to reform a bit of the law, sometimes it doesn't really touch us. And
Yes.
to me,
Yes.
it's really something that is personal.
It's not about changing your life. And we all have to change our lives fundamentally because they've all been constructed under male domination.
Mhm.
And they need changing. We have to change our way of thinking about things and the way we feel, and of course, the way we dress, the way we present ourselves to the world. Everything fundamentally needs to be changed. And at the moment, there's no discussion of changing anything except, as you say, the law. There's a nice legal decision which went our way. Uh, It gets us almost nowhere.
Exactly. And so I don't think that this is how real change is working. I don't think that you just go and bang yourself against the law and the patriarchal institution. You change first. And that's what all that really resonates. But part of the erasure is not only that the feminists don't talk about it, is that also the mainstream doesn't talk about it. And you mentioned that, in fact, when Love Your Enemy was published, there was some reaction from the patriarchy. You want to talk about how the debate was or wasn't discussed outside
I
that?
found when I was looking in my archive recently, because there's a lot that I forget, there's so much happened.
Mm,
I found a page of the Guardian newspaper. It wasn't the women's page, although at the time there was a women's page in the Guardian every every week, and it had very serious discussions. Nothing like that's imaginable now. Serious feminism gets discussed nowhere at all whatsoever. But it was such a powerful movement then, it could not be ignored. There are masses of books coming out, there was so much happening. But on this page, there was a half-page article about what's happening in feminism now, serious issues, political lesbianism. And it was just talking about the ideas of political lesbianism, as if people would know, actually, not as if they were extraordinary and new. And what was amazing to me was to think that in all of these, dinner tables of the middle classes who read The Guardian, they would be saying, "What did you think about that article about political lesbianism?" It's dangerous, you see, incredibly dangerous, because the women around those dinner tables might think, good idea. So it is very dangerous to allow these articles, these ideas to be seriously discussed. But they were. Even I was shocked at how kind of mainstream the ideas of political lesbianism were in 1986. We've come a long way. They're completely buried and hated now by other lesbians.
Yes, and by the media as well. I mean, you can see that the main strategy to erase lesbian doing anything is by just pretending it didn't happen. Like, you know, that's when we do or organize some demo or anything that's going to have an impact. They just don't talk about it. So I think this is the first step, isn't it? Let's just pretend it doesn't exist. But yes, you're right. One thing that struck me today is that the discussion now doesn't really happen with heterosexual or women in heterosexuality. It happens with biological essentialist, born this way, women
Yeah.
who are lesbians. And it's an interesting or very depressing shift, because that literature was written for heterosexual women, and
Yeah.
it's discussed by lesbians who are basically gatekeeping. What do you think about that shift? What do you think how do we get there?
Yes, it's an extraordinary shift because, first of all, these ideas of biological lesbianism were completely astonishing to me when I saw them being expressed. They mostly came from the US, and they fitted with a resurgence of butch and femme, sadomasochism, very, very reactionary anti-feminist politics is where these biological ideas emerged from. I mean, there are some who even think they could be biological butches, they have some kind of masculinity in them. Extraordinary ideas. And they started coming into the UK. Young lesbians often pick these ideas up as normal. But interestingly, I had a student, Laureen Gottschalk, my PhD student, who started working with me in the late 1990s. And what she did was interview lesbians and ask them whether they had chosen to be a lesbian or whether it was biological, which was a very interesting thing to do. And they were different age groups. And she found that the ones who became lesbians in the 70s, almost all of them thought that we chose it. Right?
Mhm.
They ticked the choice box. And then the one in the 80s, half and half were choosing, half were thought it was biological. Then by the 90s, most were saying that it was biological. So what that tells us is that political ideas come from particular historical periods where those ideas are allowed to exist because there's a revolutionary movement happening, because they're not seen as too dangerous, and at other times, they are not allowed. And so, what was happening was the backlash against feminism in the 90s and thereafter, which meant that political lesbianism got buried. So, women becoming lesbians just thought about it in a different way. They thought about what they were doing in a different way, which rather throws doubt on all the biological ideas because you can only think biologically if you come from a particular period in history and those are the ideas dominating.
Yes, yes. And we just published the interview with Anne Menashi, who did publish this study called Living the Life, and she touches on that a lot, on women perception and understanding of lesbianism depending on their background, and what prompted her study was exactly that. It was the decline in a way of those ideas in society and how the lesbian movement just disintegrated. So want to, if you're interested in that, go and see her interview and her chapter. But it's incredibly fascinating, but also it really shows the regressive, like intensely regressive time we live in today, where even feminists have completely integrated that you are born a certain way, when this is what all the feminist movement have ever done, is to dismantle these ideas that women are born a certain way and that our place in society is under men. Or it just baffles me every time that we cannot discuss sexuality
Well,
politically
eh,
because of this.
they're,
Um,
they're doing the work of male domination
yes,
by preventing women from thinking they could possibly be lesbians, imprisoning them in what for many women is actually a very unhappy situation, unable to
yes.
fulfill all their interests and their strengths because they're stuck in these relationships with men. But these biological lesbians are actually constructing those constraints, and it's very shocking.
It's very anti-feminist, and also it really brings a feeling of powerlessness. If you feel like you have no control over your life, who you choose to live with, love, how, we say even the most liberal feminist movement will say my body, my choice, and somehow it stops there. And what happens in your bed and with who is super political. You should have a say in that. And yes, it's really important to question it. Which takes me to what I'm calling the heterosexual exodus. So these 45% of women who are predicted to be single and child-free by 2030. I'm very hopeful about this, even if they don't all become lesbian, even if there is no real deep political understanding. I think it's a massive amount. If that's the case, it's more than a critical mass. It of course very different from the women's liberation movement the way you describe it. There's very little comparison, but I still think it's positive. How do you read this situation we're in today with this cohort of women?
I mean, I'm very pleased that it's happening. but it is so different. And these women are not necessarily feminists whatsoever. They
Mm.
just can't put up with porn constructed men anymore. I mean, when you've got strangulation being an ordinary practice of young women in sexuality, they're forced to be strangled. I mean, once upon a time in the women's liberation movement, we talked about a woman-defined sexuality for women. The idea that women would be being strangled as a sexual practice could not have occurred to us. But it is so extremely serious, and all of the violence that women are suffering is so extremely different, serious, and all the hatred that they are seeing men express all around them is so terrible that I'm not at all surprised that women are leaving. I wish they were leaving to join a movement and move into something which could change the wider society rather than women just leaving. But the women who are leaving are saying how much happier they are to have left. I mean, that's grace in terms of their personal happiness and getting more out of their lives. Leaving is a positive thing. But it would be even more wonderful if they were able to rise in love with other women and have a movement and create the world around them in a different way. So, yes, I'm pleased, but I wish they could have what we had. I mean, but I'm not feeling hopeless about that. I mean, you're doing like all this wonderful work. There is the book. These ideas hopefully will grow and develop more widely in society so that women do realize they have a choice. They can actually create groups. This is what they have to do. Online is just not going to get us anywhere. They need to create groups in their town to have discussions and talk about getting out. Because consciousness raising groups in the old days were very often about women talking about leaving men, as you can imagine. Women need the support to be able to do it and work out the next stage. So that's what I'm hoping. I don't know what they're going to be called because those women are going to choose this themselves. But my vision is that they will start creating groups, maybe more than one in every town, and we will have a movement again.
It would be wonderful. I am reading occasionally the odd, actually quite often, women setting up space together. So either single mom decided to live together so they can support each other, which I find extremely positive, something that I was not able to do in my time when I had a young child, but I think is wonderful. But also women buying collectively huge amounts of huge land or big properties so they can live together. And I hope that somehow through their own way they find something that will end up being similar, where if women live in the same house, they will have these conversations. They might
Of
not be
course,
as politicized to begin with. I hope they will become. And what I hope is that they find us and we find them, that we can have this conversation and they can see that this has happened before, because very often we see, oh, we are the first generation to ever do it, and I'm like, no, plenty of women did it before you. And that's the erasure again, isn't it?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And what is interesting to me is that more women are actually being a bit revolutionary about this in Asia, for instance, in Japan, Korea, and China, cutting their hair, getting rid of the feminization. Whereas in the West, the feminization that controls women means we can't even walk because of our shoes and we have to have, cross our legs so our knickers aren't on show. All of that is just horrendous in the West and getting worse. I think getting worse, whereas women are being a little bit more revolutionary as a strategy in
Mm.
other countries.
Yeah, we don't talk enough on the role of femininity as a subordination strategy. And there's a lot of discussion about how in other cultures, and I know you talked and wrote about this at length, but in other cultures, subordination, say the veil, say, other cultural practices are harmful, but we are, as the Western society, as feminists, usually quite unable to see that we are, enforced on the same thing and doing the same thing as a group and not recognizing them as harmful because we chose it. So yes,
That's right. The West isn't even seen as having a culture, let alone a harmful one. It's
no,
just the right and the good, and it comes from God, and that's basically how it is. So that women are crippled and half naked in public places
yeah.
is seen as nothing to do with tradition or culture, but as something natural and inevitable. And we mustn't talk about it as cultural, let alone harmful.
It's true. And one of the moments where I really understood it, because there's something about reading a book and there's something about actually experiencing it, is this gathering the very first gathering I went to in France, where I met you there, I remember, where it was the first time for me that there was this big amount of women. We were probably 300, and it lasted 5 days. And for the first time, I saw women not shaving their legs. In France, everybody whacks their legs all the time. It was imposed on me when I was 11. I've been doing it monthly, religiously throughout all my heterosexual life. And for the first time, women were not doing it. And then you realize, you can really see after 5 days. And then if you go the next year, you can really see, oh, that's normal, but you can only see that if you have an alternative. Otherwise, you just do what people do.
Yes, and online you can't see other women's legs.
No, not the same. So I want to go back to the anthology and the fact that we were discussing that many young women worldwide seem to be deeply engaged with the idea we're discussing, political lesbianism. Would you like younger women, feminists and lesbians or not, to take away from all we discussed, all this lesbian history?
Well, first of all, I want them to know the history so that they know that this all once happened. It was not only possible, it happened. But also, I want them to be able to feel proud of themselves as women, know that they can be lesbians, come out as lesbians, and start the revolution all over again because we've had a bit of a delay.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much. Do you have any last words, any question that you would like to just answer that I haven't asked you? Anything else?
I think I've already said it. I'm delightful that the book's there and that there are young women discussing this in many places. I want older women to be discussing it as well. Back in the 70s and 80s, women were coming out in their 70s. It
Mhm.
wasn't unusual. Coming out, starting to have relationships with women. I mean, marvelous. There's not much of that happening now either. So, yes, I think you are really helping to make this possible, and I'm delighted.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. I think we had a really deep conversation. I really enjoyed it. I know these topics are difficult to talk about, not with you, and sometimes they're difficult to hear. But I really hope that if you have watched this episode and you have found it useful, you have found it fascinating, as I have, please like and subscribe to the channel. Stay safe, stay away from men, and be your best lesbian self. And we'll see you in the next episode.